Good evening and welcome to our third episode of the SGI Solstice Speaker Series. The Solstice Speaker Series is a 4-part series built around the natural calendar. Occurring on or around the solstice and equinox, this series provides an opportunity to reflect on the motion and changes that happen each season. Topics are current, thought-provoking, and designed to create active participation towards truth and reconciliation. My name is Bailey Monsbratton. I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan and the curator of Indigenous cultural heritage here at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we gather, its Treaty 4 territory, the ancestral and traditional territories of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. We acknowledge the land in an act of reconciliation to those whose traditional territories we are on. We acknowledge those who have shared the land before us, those who continue to share the land, and those who will share the land before us, or after us, sorry. We further acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we are committed to move forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Now, I would like to invite Knowledge Keeper Tim Petra from Musqueam First Nation to open the evening with a prayer.
Tanse aninsugo amba washte ampeto washte hami takiapi wahanchka hokshla hemila. Before we do anything, we usually start off with a prayer and a smudge, so we smudged earlier. I know we have different nations, different faiths, different denominations. Support me in the best way you understand the Creator as I pray in my language, but I'll also pray in English for your benefit. So, oh, that just rang the ears. So, having said that, I hope everybody has an enjoyable evening. It's good to see some of my former friends. It's good to reconnect. With COVID, it really changed the world in a way that is really different today. So join me in prayer, please. Ha tishina tanka wambliglish katunkashna ina onchimaka wahanchka hokshla hemela tunkashla mia chekitunkashla hoashte imakia pina oyate le unshika tunkashla city Regina tunkashla SGI tunkashla mia chekia tunkashla weoch beata yasapa waziata yaluta weoyon patiri itocha gatiska tishina tanka wambliglish katunkashna ina onchimaka Mia chekia tunkashla imakia pina oyate le tiwais tunkashla le wachozni woshki woshumpi uyishki tunkashla Mia chekia tunkashla me tunkashla zingpa duta chumpani chawaki hokshila imakia pi na oyate le tiwais tunkashla Mia chekia tunkashla imakia pi na wakayoja le wia tunkashla le onchiga ka tunkashla I pray today, Grandfather, and ask that you look down upon each and every one of us with pity. With this tobacco they offer up, I pray to the grandfathers, I pray for that good health, happiness, help, and understanding we all need to survive. Take pity upon us, put a blessing on our minds, our bodies, and our spirits so we can see each other, hear each other, help each other in a better way. For without your kindness and pity, we can go nowhere. Watch over our children, our family, our loved ones, those that may be sick in our homes. Put a blessing of good health, happiness, help, and understanding on them also. I pray and give thanks for this and ask that you be with us and help us in the work we do to help each other in that way. And all my relations.
Thank you, Knowledge Keeper Tim Petra, for your thoughtful blessing, and to Bailey for your welcome and land acknowledgement. Thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to have you participate in our SGI Speaker Series program. My name is Bree Hanetka, and I am the new Executive Director for the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. I just started here on March the 1st, and I am so excited to be part of the RSM team and be working with the Friends of the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. The RSM is so proud of the great working relationship that we have with the Friends of the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. We couldn't do the great work we do without them and their efforts. Some of their board members are here tonight, so if you could just give a wave to be recognized. The SGI Solstice series is an excellent example of this valuable partnership. Not only does it help the RSM offer valued experiences to all citizens and visitors, it allows us to work with Indigenous partners to deepen our understanding and knowledge of Indigenous culture, perspectives, and worldview. Tonight's discussion will feature some of our province's top Indigenous journalists and storytellers. We are so fortunate to have them here to share their personal experiences and perspectives on the number of issues, and it will be a very engaging discussion, I am sure. Understanding is the first step to foster reconciliation and healing. It is a journey that we all need to be part of. Again, my sincere appreciation to everyone for being here, to the RSM staff, to SGI, and the Friends of the Royal Saskatchewan Museum for making tonight's event possible. And now I'd like to introduce Campbell Stevenson. Campbell is a member of the Kisikuh Saulteaux Nation and is a third-year journalism student at the U of R, and is also an Indigenous Communications Arts student at the First Nations University of Canada. So please help me welcome Campbell to say a few words.
My name is Campbell Stevenson, and I'm a third-year journalism student at the University of Regina. Although I have lived my entire life in the city of Regina, I am a member of the Kisikuh First Nation. Journalism is my conduit to storytelling. I am passionate about music and sharing the stories of Indigenous people and their lives. My hope is that through storytelling, I can connect reserve and urban communities, highlighting the beauty of our Indigenous culture. Over the past few months, I've had the great pleasure of video editing and producing for Pigisquewin, an Indigenous language platform. This opportunity has opened up for me and others the world of storytelling in the languages of our ancestors. Studying and working in the field of journalism, I feel enriched to participate and share in the gifts of these visionaries and their views on Storytellers, Our Truths, Our Perspectives, hosted by the Friends of the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. Upon learning that this installment of the Solstice Speaker Series would be something to which I could wholeheartedly relate, I seized the opportunity to attend. When I was asked to be a part of this event, I accepted with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Nevertheless, I'm thrilled to play a small role in underscoring the importance of Indigenous storytelling. This evening, we are very fortunate to have four of Saskatchewan's premier Indigenous journalists with us. I'm sure we are all looking forward to hearing their personal experiences and reporting around truth and reconciliation and their perspectives on storytelling and how it relates to Indigenous history and culture. At this time, I would like to introduce our panel. Please give us a wave when your name is called. Nelson Bird. And John Lagimodiere. Kerry Benjoe. And our moderator tonight, Cherish Francis. I will now turn things over to Cherish to get this discussion going. Thank you. Miigwech.
Awesome. Well, first off, I just want to say thank you to everybody in their opening remarks, and I'd like to thank Elder Patra for the prayer this evening, and I just want to welcome everybody to the Solstice Series this evening. I know that we've all been looking forward to this panel and this discussion, and really being able to put our best foot forward and talk about Indigenous journalism, a little bit about ourselves, and I guess just a little bit about how we impact journalism here in the province of Saskatchewan, but not only in Saskatchewan, but nationally. I have the great honor to introduce John Lagimodiere. John Lagimodiere and I have known each other for over a decade. When I first started journalism, John has his own company called the Aboriginal Consulting Services, and his partner Deidre, I believe, is in the audience, and he has two children named Riel and Willow, who are now adults. I remember them as little children. John is also, with his company, he does a lot of Indigenous awareness seminars for government and industry. So if you guys do Indigenous awareness training, John is usually the guy there doing the training. John has, his interest in the summertime is he likes to boat, he said, and he likes to spend time with his family and also do some fishing in the wintertime, like all Canadians. He likes to play some hockey, and I kind of poked at and said, old-timers hockey's these days, right?
Very old.
And you know what? And John actually, he's a graduate of the University of Saskatchewan, and he graduated with a sociology degree. So please welcome John Lagimodiere.
Thank you. Thank you, Cherish. And just for the record, you forgot about my journalism work.
Oh, yeah.
So 25 years, I own a newspaper called Eagle Feather News. That's kind of why I'm here.
Yeah.
She's just being fancy, 2 laptops, all just too big.
Oh, wow.
Cherish. Welcome, and again, Tim, thank you for the smudge and the prayer today to get us going. My pleasure is to introduce Kerry Benjoe. I've known Kerry since she was in 2001, I believe was the year, when we published her first article ever that published in Eagle Feather News. Kerry Soto Cree from Muscopeta. She's a survivor of residential schools personally as well as intergenerationally. Survivor of domestic violence, and she is fierce and very colorful. She's a mother to 3, a Coco to 1, so grandmother. She's got Inca certificate, I think they call it. She's got an English degree. She's got an Indigenous studies degree. And then she went on to a 13-year career at the leader post, cutting her way through the journalism. And then she left that to go get her master's in journalism. That's pretty good. And then she did some time at CBC as the Indigenous storyteller. And now Kerry is the editor and one of the owners of Eagle Feather News. And I think that's exactly where she should be. Help me welcome Kerry Benjoe.
Wow. I impressed myself. I'm here to introduce somebody who doesn't need an introduction, Nelson Bird. He spent many years in front of the camera. I first met him personally in 2001 when I took the Inca Summer Institute. He was one of my instructors and one of the people, John as well, who inspired me to pursue journalism. He is now the assignment editor at CTV, the first Indigenous person to hold that position in all of Canada, which is a major accomplishment. He hosted Indigenous Circle for 15 years, and he's mentored many, many journalists along the way. Creason Adjikude, another premier journalist, you've seen him. He's on CTV National now. They still keep in contact. He's Nelson's surrogate son.
Or was money.
Nelson is from the Pikisis Cree Nation. He's the youngest of 6. His mother was a teacher caregiver. His father was a World War II veteran. And Nelson is the proud father of 2 pets. 2 dogs, yeah. 2 dogs. Yeah. I see them all the time on Facebook. I can't remember their names. But yeah,
yes.
Here's Nelson.
Thank
Nelson
you.
Bird.
Thank you. Thank you. We had a rehearsal a little bit earlier. We sat here, just a sound check, and we laughed, and we had a really good discussion. So this laughter is very natural, and it's who we are as storytellers. And my wife is Judy, by the way. She's in the audience here somewhere. I can't see. All I see is a light and some faces. I'm here to introduce Cherish. Cherish and I go way back. She was a student many years ago at the Lethbridge College, and I met her at something called the Battle of the Little Big Puck. Anybody hear of that? It's a game that takes place in Maple Creek, Saskatchewan. It's where the Indians and the Cowboys face off, and they have a hockey game for charity. And it's a great event, and I recommend you go to it. But Cherish took her classes at Lethbridge College in media. She eventually got a job at CTV Prince Albert. And I kind of pushed her, I kind of nudged. I do that with a lot of the young people. I said, go apply here, go try, just go, don't be shy. And they do, and some of them end up, like Cherish, in a high position where she is today. But she started with CTV-PA, she went to CTV Calgary, eventually APTN as a video journalist, which is carrying the camera equipment and everything else, as I was doing. So we'd meet in the hallway at where we worked and struggling with our equipment and, and sweating and how's your day? It was good. It was a physical job. Cherish is a mother of two, Peyton and Wynn. She now has a company called Makwa Innovations, which is a consulting thing, and she's really good at communicating. Whenever we need press releases from people and organizations, she's the person. And I always use her as an example to how to do a press release. When she sends out press releases, I'll actually copy them and say, hey, this is how you do a press release. All the 5 W's are right there. So Cherish is, like I said, from Nikanit, and she has one sibling, and her parents, I didn't get your parents' names, but there's an election tomorrow on your survey.
Yes, there is.
Her dad's running.
And her dad's running. Anyways, Cherish Francis.
Well, thanks for that fine introduction. We have a great group of panelists today, and I'm very honored to be here to be the moderator. And yes, as Nelson has said, my community goes into election tomorrow. My chief is my dad's the chief of the Nikanit First Nation. And my joke, and I'm going to tell this, and I know a couple of you have heard me say this, but if you haven't met a real Indian princess, now you have. So that's always my go-to joke. So now you guys know I won't tell it again. But that being said, I'm so honored to be here today and to talk about journalism and really to talk about our stories and our connection to the people here in Saskatchewan and in Canada. We have a prestigious group of panelists that have really made an impact in Saskatchewan. I've known each and every one of you guys, and I've worked with you at various capacities in my career. And, as Neil said, alluded to, I do have a consulting company, but I'm also the CEO of our ECDEV Corporation, and I'm working in economic development these days. So just really all kinds of different hats I wear. But, the reason why I'm here is to talk about journalism and really, talk about the TRC's 94 calls to action and what does reconciliation mean to you. And I talk to all kinds of different people in industry and government, and I always ask them, what is your calls to action? As an individual, have you looked at these 94 calls to action? And if you haven't, I think that you probably should. And if you're going to, figure out where you fit in that space in terms of 94 calls to action. And today, we're going to talk about the media and reconciliation calls to action, which is number 84 to 86. And, I'm going to actually go line by line here because I just want everybody in the audience to kind of understand what those calls to action are. So number 84, we call upon the federal government to restore and increase funding to the CBC, Radio Canada, to enable Canada's national public broadcaster to report reconciliation and be properly reflective of the diverse cultural languages and perspectives of Aboriginal peoples, including but not limited to increasing Aboriginal programming, including Aboriginal language speakers, increasing equitable access for Aboriginal people to jobs, leadership positions, professional development opportunities within the organization, continue to provide dedicated news coverage and online public information resources on issues and concerns on Aboriginal people and all Canadians. You can tell I used to read a teleprompter. Including the history and the legacy of residential schools in the reconciliation process. Call to action number 85, we call upon the Aboriginal People Television Network as an independent non-profit broadcaster with programming by, for, and about Aboriginal peoples to support reconciliation, including but not limited to continue to provide leadership and programming and organizational culture that reflects the diverse cultures, languages, and perspectives of Aboriginal peoples, continue to develop media initiatives that inform and educate Canadian public and connect Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. And last but not least, number 86, we call upon Canadian journalism programs and media schools to require education for all students on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and the legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, treaties, and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal-Crown relations. So leading into that, with our panelists here, Nelson and Kerry and John, I think that, I'd like to chat a little bit about the TRC 94 calls to action, and particularly journalism, and how do we, as an Indigenous journalism and communicators, how do we, I guess, contribute to those calls to action? So maybe, I'll do ladies first, and I'll give Kerry the floor first.
Well, as a person who's worked in several newsrooms, I've taken it on myself to educate and share my history with as much people as I can, because, as you know, Indigenous history has been left out of the Canadian history. When I was in residential school, the only history I learned was what was taught in the provincial curriculum. So I wasn't in a residential school, and I didn't even learn about the treaties. I didn't learn about anybody who was of Indigenous ancestry. It wasn't until I went to university that I realized what my history was. And I think it's really important that, as a person who is educated in this, it's my job and my role to educate people as much as possible. And from the time I started working, I always included a little bit of history in every story I wrote, because it's important that we make that information public, and so people are educated. And so as a journalist, I think it's really important that we not only document our current history, but we acknowledge our history in general, because it has been left out. And it's really important that we do as much as we can as journalists, as storytellers, to share that knowledge with as many people as we can.
Awesome, great response. Maybe John, I'll let you.
Yeah, because this goes right up my alley with the Indigenous awareness seminars, because almost every single call to action, whether it's about the justice system or business or whatever, says take Aboriginal awareness training, right? Because those gaps. And unfortunately, those gaps here in Canada, and very much so in Saskatchewan, I grew up in the same curriculum, a lot of those gaps were always filled with the myths and the misconceptions and some of the resentments, and sometimes you sprinkle in a bit of racism, and it's fractured our relationships. And back in 2016, 17, there was a bunch of us journalists in Saskatoon, Betty Ann Adam, Doug Cuthan, Dave Curtin, Murray Brass. We pulled together that media and the reconciliation in the media. And Dr. Marie Wilson, who is one of the commissioners on the TRC, she spoke there. And she says a lot of things about the stories that we hear today, we get this. But a lot of the things when it comes to Indigenous stories, to understand it, you got to have this. So she said, we got to teach this part. So we, brought in the weekly newspaper folks and some TV, and we had a thing. We had and we did the part there. But it's telling those stories. So when we're talking with Indigenous journalists, and really too non-Indigenous journalists, because there's way more of them than there is of us, they got to understand that. And our good fortune, I think, from being from the community and being able to tell those stories is we know that background and we know the impact personally, right? And if it's not personally, I know tons of people that went and told the stories that give you that perspective. So when you're trying to pull that story together, it can be cohesive, yet still teach at the same time and still stick to like journalist standards. So it's a real challenge, and it's never been more important. But, when you look at the calls to action, they laid it out for us. It was the real, other than the truth that we got, the gift was from those commissioners was those calls to action. They didn't recommend nothing. They says, we want to call Canadians to action. And they laid it out for us. So if we follow that, that's our roadmap forward. So, and it starts, we have a responsibility as journalists to make sure that those stories are full.
We do, definitely we do. I recall the event that John is talking about, the TRC. It was to do with the media. It was to do with news directors and journalists who deal just with daily news, but also with a strong focus on the TRC. I recall that event so clearly because there were news directors and newspapers and broadcasters in that room who probably didn't know a whole lot about us as Indigenous people. So they were their jaws were dropping open, listening to some of the stories that were presented that day. I was one of the speakers, and I too come from a history of generational residential schools. I didn't attend myself. However, my parents, grandparents, every uncle, every aunt, all went to these schools, so we grew up with them. We knew the stories. So the TRC things, when they came about, I remember my news director asked me if I wanted to attend this and maybe learn, even though I knew a lot about it. And I said, no, I think you should go. And he did go, and he took part. He took part in the pipe ceremonies, and all these things that happened that 20, 30 years ago, I couldn't envision this. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I started CTV. Was one of the first people at CTV Regina as an Indigenous person. Not the first. The first was Carol Rose Golden Eagle, who was Carol Adams. She was a journalist in our newsroom in 1983, a journalist and anchor person. And you can imagine the struggles that she faced in a room full of white men, being from a reserve in northern Saskatchewan, having to do this job that I'm doing as an assignment editor now. So when it comes back to TRC, we've come a long way. Now we still got a long ways to go with these things, with these calls to action, not recommendations, not suggestions. They're actually calls to action. So when they are developed and they do come through to fruition in journalism schools and newsrooms, I feel good. I feel good that I've been part of this journey for many people in journalism throughout this in this country for the last many years, and my goal is to get the young people involved. Like when I was talking about Cherish, and I really push for the young people to get involved. The young man who spoke at the podium here, I want him to go into TV. He may go to print, but hey, that's
nothing wrong with print, Nelson.
Wrong print, yeah. You're going to gang up on me. I always push for broadcasts, but that's just me. But yeah, TRC is important, but I think is really important for the news directors and the managers of all media outlets to become educated. Open your eyes, that phrase, but in this case for sure.
Can I just chip in on that? But it's also about changing the narrative and what stories they're covering, like what stories they're covering. And we talked to some of those guys that were running these weekly newspapers surrounded by reserves, right? And what do you cover for Indigenous stuff? Car accident, trauma, tragedy, bad things. I say, you ever go cover their graduation? You ever go into, and they're like, no. I says, well, why wouldn't you? Oh, never thought of that, right? Because that wasn't part of their thought. So that when we have Indigenous journalists, we know who's kicking butt in the community. We know who's making waves. We can bring that into the narrative. And that's what we really tried to do at Eagle Feather, was change that narrative from that negativity and that trauma-based reporting to look at what's going on in the community that's real, that we can build on. And I think that responsibility has kind of trickled a bit to some more of the mainstream. Like they're getting a little bit better at it. But a lot of those weeklies had a lot of issues with them just totally ignoring, unless it was a car crash, something like that, and then they were all over it.
Can I add something to that? I'm just going to add in a story from my experience. When I walked into the Leader Post newsroom, I was the first Indigenous journalist hired there full-time. So when I went in there, I was pitching stories that nobody knew about. I remember when there was new regulations regarding border crossings. One of the things that I brought up was, what about the Jay Treaty? And my assignment editor said, what is that? And so I had to educate him about the Jay Treaty, and he was like, well, I don't know. And so through my inquiring and through taking my own knowledge into the newsroom, I educated the whole newsroom on the Jay Treaty, the Certificate of Indian Status, and a lot of them didn't even know that we had to carry a card. It wasn't until I brought it up and brought it into the newsroom that they began to have a grasp of the reality of what it is to be an Indigenous person living in Canada, and the restrictions and the rules and everything that we go through. They had a real live person who was explaining how these legislation, these laws, these things impact us on a personal level. And my story on the Jay Treaty, I ended up phoning all the way down to the border security for America, and they had no idea. And I was still an intern at the time, and needless to say, I had a front page story. I think it was in 2006, 2007. I wasn't there very long, and yeah, I had a a front page story, and from there I was totally addicted to being a print journalist and breaking those stories.
I just got to add one more thing. Sorry, Judge. I know.
It's going to be terrible.
And this goes off for what she said, because being that first person, that first Indigenous person in the newsroom there, for me, a generation a little earlier before her, when I started at CTV Regina, I was the Aboriginal reporter. So everything I did had that prefix, Aboriginal reporter. Everything I did, no matter what, there would be a staff list, Aboriginal reporter, Nelson Bird, Aboriginal. So anybody that toured our building, this is Wayne Mantika, this is Carl Worth, this is Nelson Bird, our Aboriginal reporter. And this is John, and this is Joe, and the staff list, my business card, Aboriginal. So everything was like, oh, here's Nelson, our Aboriginal reporter. And not that I'm ashamed of it, never been ashamed of being Indigenous ever, but I'm the only one who ever had that race prefix in front of me every single time. So I said to my boss, why don't you put Ukrainian reporter for Wayne Mantika, or English, German, whatever Carl Worth is. Oh, we never even thought of that, and that's the phrase I hear. We never even thought of that.
Yeah, no, those are, I definitely, I'll supplement to the story too. I was a journalist for, about 8 years, and I think in 2005 I started my career, and it was a lot of, working with other journalists, non-Indigenous journalists, and really giving them the opportunity to chat about Indigenous people, and they really didn't know how to approach us. I think about some of the journalists at the time, and now they're in, higher positions, CBC News, like Jill, or she's in CTV, I think, or Jill Smith. I always remember her, and she was always asking me, like, how do I approach this person, or how do I, and I think that things are getting better in that respect, in terms of they're starting to ask questions, and that kind of leads into our next discussion. Like, my background, being a journalist, I'm also in the communications part of it, where I do a lot of public relations. I recently was just working with Star Blanket Cree Nation. I was the media relations person for the recent announcement at LeBret Indian Residential School back in I guess it would have been in January. We had made that announcement about the discovery of the jawbone, and we actually I was brought in, I guess it would have been probably in November, so I knew for a little bit longer than everybody else, and we did a lot of media relations training, and just getting everybody prepared for the media, because we knew it was going to be an international story, which it was. And I actually had let Nelson know, prior to us actually having the event, that what it was in the discovery, and just hoping that he wouldn't tell the day before and, break the story before everybody else. But I mean, that kind of leads into our next discussion in regards to Indian Residential School and the impacts that it's had in our communities, the impacts that it's had on journalism, and just the impacts that I think that it's had on society in general. I think that people have woken up, and the term being woke in regards to the Kamloops discovery. Now, it's closer to home for Kerry, because I know Kerry went to LeBret Indian Residential School, so I can't even imagine, the feelings that you felt when the announcement at LeBret came down. So, I'd like to pass it off to you guys and talk a little bit about residential school, because I think it impacts us as Indigenous people, because, it's impacted all of us. So that being said, I'll let Kerry, you lead again, because you are the only residential school survivor sitting up here, in which I want to give you a round, for telling your story. So, Kerry, I'll let you go first.
It's a really precarious position to be a residential school survivor and be a journalist, especially covering my own school, because when I go down there, I remember all my experiences being in that place, and some of them are good, and some of them are not so good. But one thing I really learned along the way was how important it was for me as the last generation in my family to attend a residential school. All 4 generations of my family actually attended the LeBret Indian Residential School. So it really hit close home, really hit me hard. You know, like, I knew it was coming. I knew it was going to happen because LeBret was one of the first schools that the federal government opened in 1884, federally funded it, and it was the last to close in 1998. So the history of LeBret is really long, and almost everybody in my family was impacted specifically by that school. And so a lot of my family history is in that school and in those grounds. And so, as a journalist and covering residential schools, it was really important for me to bring as much education to every story I covered. And I remember after the apology, the national apology was made, there was this sort of idea that this chapter was closed and these stories of residential school survivors were not as important. I remember still having to pitch these stories to my assignment editor, and I remember being told that this story is no longer a story. We don't need these stories because, you know, the apology has been made, you know, the financial compensation has been made, those stories, we've heard it all. We've heard it all, is what I was told. But sitting at my desk, I continued to tell these stories, and anytime that there was like a lull in the newsroom, I would do these stories and I would bank them. And so anytime there was space, anytime they needed stories, I'd have a story to publish. And so I kept that story going for as long as I was a journalist, and I kept it going and I kept it going. And it wasn't until, you know, when the discovery that 215 unmarked graves was found in Kamloops, I think it really hit me hard. You know, all those stories, all those things that I reported on, it really became a reality. And I seen how everything switched. There was suddenly this national attention, this national spotlight on Canada, and I seen everybody, all the newsrooms jump up, and everybody wanted this story. And I just felt like, well, my job is done here. And so I needed to focus on something else. And John announced he was retiring, and I was like, I wasn't ready to leave the newsroom. I wasn't done telling stories, and I found my way back to Indigenous storytelling because I really wanted, although I kept that story alive, I thought it was important to let people know that Indigenous people are more than just trauma. We are successful, we are passionate, we love our families, and we are just people. We are human beings who have things to be proud of. And so I found my way back into just Indigenous journalism, and I don't know if I answered the question, but...
That's good. No, it's really good. And that storytelling part is so important because you've been telling those stories for a long, long time now. We all have been, you know, not just in the setting as a professional journalist, but as people sitting in a room full of whoever, listening to the stories of our parents and grandparents and everybody else. For me, I've been telling these stories of residential school survivors for 25 years. I remember sitting with Mike Panay. I remember sitting with so many people doing the story, them telling me about their experiences over and over and over again, at least, 5-10 times a year for Indigenous Circle and in news also. But it seemed to not sink in. It just did not seem to sink in. We knew, as Indigenous people, if I told a story, you're going to believe it, because we're Indigenous. We know this is true. But for many of the non, it was like, oh, we're tired of that. We heard it all before. When's it ever going to end? Get over it. That kind of attitude sometimes. So I've been telling, and like you, when Kamloops happened, it was a punch in the gut for me. Even though I knew this had happened from stories that I grew up with, for some reason it just impacted me emotionally really hard and mentally. And I remember the day, for some reason there was a day that Creason was on Ottawa, and he was covering the story nationally, and he was coming down here to do stuff in Regina and Keesakus, I think, or Cody's. So he was traveling around, but he'd call me and we'd talk, and he would cry because it's so hard. So we have to lean on each other as people, as journalists, as Indigenous people sometimes, because it's just hard. You need to talk about these at the end of the day, how you deal with these stories, whether it was for me walking my dogs, talking to my wife, but we can't keep it in. Now it's out there for everybody.
Yeah, and I would go so far as to say, yeah, for sure, First Nation, Métis, Inuit people that went to the residential schools paid the high price. But so is every average ordinary Canadian to this day, paying the price of the Indian residential schools. When you look at the demographics that they collectively have inherited of the Indigenous people being the most marginalized people in our country, our over in incarceration, our staggeringly poor health numbers, the Canadians are still paying that price to this day. And many of them not even knowing. And through the awareness training we're doing, I had this young man, 30 years old. We did a seminar, it's probably 6-7 years ago. And we did day one, and we ended right at residential schools at we told that story, me and my facilitating partner, Winston McLean. He's from James Smith, which is another outcome of Indian residential schools, but that's a different case altogether. Next day, we said, anybody got a comment? And the guy goes, yeah. He says, I'm 30 years old. He says, yesterday was the first time, he says, I ever heard anything about the residential schools. Blew my mind. He says, I had no idea. But then he says he went home, and his 6-year-old son come up to him and said, hey, Dad, look at this. Held up a piece of paper, and he had a little stick kid with an orange shirt. He says, Dad, did you know that they used to take First Nation kids away from their parents? And for 10 months out of the year, they couldn't stay with their parents. They had to go to these things called residential schools. They couldn't be with their parents, Dad. Did you know that? The guy goes, yeah, I knew that. Found that out today. Right? So when we got that, this gives me hope, is what it does give me, is that the curriculum is, getting a little bit more caught up. You got to have the right teacher. You got to have the right intention. But here's a 30-year-old guy. Blew my mind, he says. No idea. And now we got a 6-year-old getting age appropriate. So that gives me hope. But we have to remember every Canadian in this country is paying the price. And to Kamloops, when they come out with their 215 international spotlight, like 60 Minutes is coming in here, the Chinese government is shaming us for our human rights, right? So, and justifiably so. But it woke up Canadians, not anger, turned on the church, right? Catholic Church, 70-some% of the schools hadn't paid their $25 million, begging poverty kind of things, and that anger went to those parishes, and those parishes, said, holy smack, like they're mad too. They pushed it up to the bishops pushed it up, and then we saw delegations finally go talk to the Pope, right? And then, what a segue.
Yeah. It's a good transition.
It's like we planned this.
Yeah, he was on point there, John.
And so I guess last summer we had a visit from a fella.
Well, you kind of stole the words right out of my mouth there, John. Our next topic is about, the palpable apology and, how it impacted us as journalists, and also how did it impact, regular Canadians. And, I will tell a quick story too. My daughter's 6 years old, and I have a 16-year-old daughter. And within that 10-year time frame, definitely the education system has changed significantly. My 16-year-old is just like really starting to learn about, in the last couple of years. My little one, she knows everything. Knows about residential school. She was telling me about Ramadan the other day and seeing the Ramadan moon. Yeah. She's like, did you see that? I'm like, no, where is that? Right, but thanks for telling me, and I'll go back to, I do think there's hope, like I was actually out west a couple weeks ago, and there was this young girl, and she's working with Star Blanket Cree Nation. and she's a young girl, and she's working on her master's, and her master's in Indigenous studies. And she said it was actually the apology that changed her whole educational journey, and she wanted to learn more about Indigenous people. And it was interesting to have a conversation with her, and it actually, I went to bed thinking of her, because I thought to myself, you know what, there's really hope in this next generation of young people, non-Indigenous people, because they're starting to think about these things and how it's actually impacting our communities, the socioeconomic conditions. And she says it's a very interesting discussion table at home, because her parents are still they're trying to do reconciliation, they really don't know how, and they say off comments, and she's calling them out, right? And having those hard conversations. So I think that there is a lot of hope out there for us to move forward together and create real change, right? But that being said, I'll give the floor to Nelson in regards to the palpable apology and, covering it from your newsroom. How was that?
Right. So we, after the residential schools, and just leading from John, and when we talked about how, it was coming, we knew this guy was going to show up here. We didn't know exactly when, we knew who, of course, or where he was going to go. So when we found out the locations of his apology, of course, people were outraged. Why is he just going there? Why is he just going here? Why doesn't he come here? And so either regardless of where he went, he came. The media all over Canada, CTV, that I can speak for, sent a whole crew along with him on his trip. Well, we had a reporter, Jill Makwa in Winnipeg, who went to the Vatican, traveled with him to Edmonton, then to Quebec, then to Northwest Territories. So it was a journey for all of them. A difficult journey, but one that had many Canadians, Indigenous people, wondering, is this necessary? How important is this? How has this changed the lives of survivors? That's still my question. Has it made a huge, significant difference in what happens and how we move forward and how we look back? Personally, I don't know. I didn't go to residential school, so it's not a major impact to me. But as a storyteller, as a journalist, it was a huge story. It was a huge story. Everywhere they went, there was something happening. So watching this unfold in front of our eyes in real time was very significant. My reporters in my newsroom, they're very open-minded. The young reporters are so open-minded about Indigenous culture. I'm so impressed. They want to learn. They want to go and cover these stories. It's not like I'm pushing them and they're being forced to. I don't want to do that. They want to learn, and they often come to me with ideas about Indigenous things. So even with this, how has this affected people here? We find people affected. That was our goal. How does this affect people in Regina, in Saskatchewan? And the responses vary. Just looking at the crowd right now, anybody here, and if you can put up your hands, I really can't see you. How many people here have been affected by residential schools? Attending, generational, things like that. There's quite a few hands here. And you all are actually, like John said, we're all affected by that in some way or another. So, and the Pope's apology, what do you think? I don't know.
Well, the Pope's apology, I think it had a purpose. I don't know how much impact it had on survivors. I know I talked to my mom about the apology, and she was like, "What are words going to do? It doesn't matter to me," she said. And I looked at it from both angles. I was raised Catholic. My mom was a devout Catholic for most of my life. And then I went to residential school. And then she, after my dad died, didn't attend church after that. So that was my end to my whole Catholic education. But for me, looking at the apology and what it meant, it was important to have the highest Catholic representative come here and actually acknowledge it, because it was having him acknowledge these atrocities kind of made it real for all those naysayers, the ones that said, oh, well, get over it, that's the past, it doesn't matter. They had their person come across and say, I'm sorry. I think we really needed to have him come here and make that apology, not for us, but for all of Canada and for all Catholics. It was an acknowledgement of the wrongdoing, and I think that was more important because of the whole acknowledgement. For years, for generations, we have been sloughed off and told to get over it. Having that acknowledgement was really important, and as a survivor, as a representative of my family, and knowing my mom wasn't happy with it because she's still affected by all of what she's seen. She has never shared any stories with me other than the fact that she said she was a witness to many atrocities. She still has difficulty. She's 83 years old and has difficulty still talking about that time. So I know it still impacts a lot of people. And as a person who's gone through the system, I understand that the way I was brought up is completely different. Like, I am the first generation to have been able to raise my children from birth to adulthood without any government interference. And I think that is really significant because my children are the only ones to not have those schools around for them to attend. And when we talk about residential schools, it's not of the past, it's still now, it's still resonating. And there's still a whole generation of students that haven't gotten up and shared their stories. There's a generation younger than me still that haven't taken, their space. And so this story is going to continue for generations still because those people are still in their 30s. So I think it was really important that the papal apology was made, and regardless of how regardless of my mother's opinion and regardless of my opinion, I think it was really necessary.
Well said, Kerry. With the papal apology, I follow this group that follows the 94 calls to action. They check them off when they're done. I think 13 have kind of been fully completed. They only gave the Pope a half a check mark because he did not acknowledge mental, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. He just apologized for the schools. And the apology and the calls to action actually called to acknowledge those things. So he didn't do that, but he apologized. So there's merit to that. And some people I know that were survivors that couldn't even bother to turn on the TV to see that because that's not their way. But everybody has their way, right? And so to each their own. So good, he did that. Cost us $50 million as Canadians. We also have to acknowledge that, right? And they owed us 25. So, right? So a little mad. But I just want to reiterate, too, we also have to acknowledge, and a lot of Canadians, when they found out about the truth and whatnot, kind of felt guilt, eh? It's kind of hard not to when you hear those stories. But we have to acknowledge that most Canadians today, residential schools wasn't our fault. Most, we weren't making the policies. We certainly weren't driving the grain trucks, picking those kids up. Most Canadians didn't even know. But the thing is, the goal of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is we got that truth and allowed those survivors to put that truth out there, and for them internally to let it out, start that process and heal, but then allowed us as Canadians to hear it. Right? And then that's when it was like, oh my God, what have we done here? And so everyone's like, feel bad, terrible, but we have to remember, not our fault, but we have to acknowledge this. Canada did that, right? And we're Canadians. So what's our responsibility now? And the last gift was those calls to action. And we're seeing them, and we're having big international events like the Pope coming here and this, but it's the day-to-day stuff that your average ordinary Canadians can do by correcting that conversation with your friend who brings in a racist trope into the conversation or a stereotype or plays that. It's time to say stop. Correct the conversation and do something personally, right? Because our responsibility is how we do this going forward and reconciling, like taking that history, reconciling it and following those calls to action, because there's something for everybody in there, whether it's government, grassroots, sports, culture, there's something for everybody in there. So now's the time we got to do our part Pope did part of his. He's kind of a big deal. So we got to do ours as Canadians, and that's fix those conversations, start moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are some great answers. And, like I said, everybody in the audience, I think, as you walk away from here, I think one of the things that you need to do is read the 94 calls to action and kind of figure out where do you fit in that space. I like to put myself in spaces and create space for Indigenous people. And I always say that I'm at tables that I shouldn't be at, but I'm there because we need to create that space for Indigenous people. And I'm often the only Indigenous person sitting around a table with a bunch of businessmen primarily, right? I was just on a panel about Indigenous women economics, but that being said, just creating that space for us Indigenous people, that should be your goal. I always ask them, do you have any Indigenous friends? And a lot of them don't have Indigenous friends, right? And I think it's your duty to, find an Indigenous friend, learn about us. We're very funny people.
We are.
I like to think anyways,
We are.
right?
We are.
Right?
We like to laugh.
Yeah, we're talking about some serious issues, but, we're really funny people. We're kind, we're humble, and, don't be scared of us. Everybody has a story.
I just need to tell one story.
Yes, no, go ahead.
I need to tell one story, and it just reminded me of how people will, say get over it, that whole thing. And we get phone calls into our newsroom quite often from angry viewers. And it's my job to take the calls because I'm the assignment editor. So the phone's right there, they're going to call. Sometimes I cringe because I'm thinking, oh my God, who's this? Unknown name, unknown number. And a lot of times they're very angry. A lot of times they're nice, but mostly angry. And they're racist sometimes, those Indians, those Indians. There's a lot of that when we do stories about Indigenous stuff. Those Indians, why are you doing a story about Indians? And I'll say, and they'll say something really nasty and very derogatory, and I'll say, so what do your Indigenous friends think when you say that? I'll say to that caller, and they'll go, well, they agree, or they don't, and it just shuts them up. It just shuts them up. As soon as I say, what do your Indigenous friends think when you say something like that? And it just halts. So my staff, they sometimes think it's entertaining for me to answer the phone. Because they can hear me in the newsroom. And they go, ooh, what's he going to say now? What's he going to say to this person? And it's passive aggressive, but I have a nice way of telling them to
suck it.
Suck it. And I know some of my staff are here tonight, so they can attest to that.
No, that's a great story, and I think that you had to tell that story. And I know that we've kind of been all on serious issues, and we're going to do one more serious issue because I do think that we need to talk about it, and it's missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I'd actually like to add men into that as well because it doesn't only impact Indigenous women and girls. Being an Indigenous woman, and Kerry, you can probably say the same thing, is we're always looking behind our back. We're always on alert. We're always super aware of the situations that we're in because it doesn't matter. You could be the most educated person, you could be the best speaker, but to some people you're just another brown face and you don't mean much, right? And I think these panelists have definitely dealt with this issue probably multiple times, and I think about some of the coverage that I did as a journalist and how it impacted me as a human being, interviewing a mom that just lost her daughter, a daughter that just lost her mom. And I remember doing this story, and this little girl was just and I interviewed her, and she said, I just want my mom to come home. It was so heartbreaking. And I still remember when she was found and the impact it had on me personally. It was, I was no longer a journalist, but I still followed the story, and I called the mom, and I just, I apologized, and I just said, I wish there was something more that we could do, but I think just bringing light to the issues and just understanding the issues is what we need to do as journalists. So, I'll leave it up to whoever wants to respond first.
I'll just say that, it's my goal when we cover these stories, it's always been from day one to personalize that person. Just make that person a mother, a daughter, cousin, whoever it is. Because I've sat in many living rooms, kitchens, front yards, and spoken to people about their missing daughter, their missing mother, so many times over the years that it does hurt. It's really bothersome how this continues to happen. But these are like my cousins. These are my relatives. These are the people I may not be blood related to, but in our culture, that is my cousin in a way. So when I'm listening to these stories, I make my goal that I'm going to make sure that people at home know that she was a mother, a daughter, a sister. And this goes way back. Before even I became a journalist, there was a woman named Pamela George. You remember that case?
Yeah.
That one pissed me off like big time because of not all the media coverage, but some of the media coverage was very unfair to her as a person. It was prostitute, found dead, 2 young white boys' lives ruined. I'm just saying it like that because that's basically how it kind of was portrayed for a long time. So when the court case happened, they were found guilty, but at the same time, what was she? She was, in the public's eye, a native hooker. That's how people perceived her. Meanwhile, these 2 upstanding young white boys, they have to go to court. Oh my God, their future is just ruined. I was a journalist. I was a student at the time in the 90s when that was taking place, and I was watching, and I was pissed off at that. But I promised myself that I would tell the real story of who these people are, these women, these men. It doesn't matter; they're real people. And that's
Yeah, for sure. And it's. And in the community, and just, the resilience of the community, right? We're still here after all that has happened in history. We're still here. I was very fortunate for a big part of Eagle Feather News to have a mentor, Warren Goulding. And he wrote a book called Just Another Indian. And it was about a serial killer in Saskatchewan that was killing First Nations women. His name was John Martin Crawford. You probably never heard of him because nobody ever covered him. But around the same time, Paul Bernardo was coming. And this was international. There was news all across Canada. Paul Bernardo, I think, killed 2 women. Paul Bernardo, oh, yeah. Well, nobody showed up for John Martin Crawford's trial. And one of the local Saskatchewan columnists said, it's not like these women were expected home for supper at a particular time when they're doing that profession. And, so it's like they were just another Indian, And that was the mainstream media's just didn't give a flying flip. But when we're in that community, we know these people. And, Megan Gallagher in Saskatoon, good friends with her dad, and tons of work with. Lost her to the streets and or to the terrible people that did whatever they did there. And, so it's very personal for us as well. And a lot of people can skim around and skirt around the issue because they're not personally affected, and they don't know nobody that was personally affected. So, it's just another story that flies by. And prior, they didn't even used to do a story.
Yeah, absolutely. Kerry?
I'll bring back one of the stories I covered. Back as a journalist, one of the things we do is we look for stories. We read the paper, we look at what everybody else is doing, and anything that raises a question becomes a story. I remember, I forget what year it was, but I was looking at this one story and reading some stuff, and there was an announcement of this special committee on murdered and missing Indigenous women. It was supposed to, they made this big announcement. There was money set aside to have this special commission. And I was like, well, where's this commission at? So I started making calls. And what I found was no one was doing anything. And that became the story. My editor said, do the story, find out what you can, and we'll run it on the anniversary. And so that's what I did. I did my job, and we held on to the story until, the anniversary of when that announcement was made. And again, it was like made front page, and it was brought up in the legislative. They were holding up a Leader Post newspaper and saying, the opposition was calling on the government about their lack of response and how they weren't doing anything. And that's when I realized, as a journalist, it's not only our job to tell the stories, but it's also our job to hold those in power to account, to make sure that they honor their promises and their commitments so that, the families get some sort of acknowledgement. They might not get justice, but at least there's some acknowledgement of what they've gone through. We have commissions, we had the National Inquiry. I'm kind of iffy on what it's actually accomplished. I know they came out with this big report on what was supposed to be done. I'm not sure what actually has been done because being in the news, we still see and we still hear of many Indigenous women being, murdered, gone missing. Those stories are still there. And I think it's really important for us as journalists to never stop telling those stories, never stop raising the issues, and never stop holding government to account for their lack of response.
Well said.
Awesome, thank you. So we have 6 minutes left, and we had picked 10 topics, and I think we've only been through 4. We're storytellers. We could talk forever. I said I could probably talk for a whole hour to myself. So but that being said, I do want to pick 2 quick topics. I do think that this next topic, the rise of social media, is very important to talk about in and around this table. I'll just tell a quick story. I was working for CTV Calgary. It was in 2005, and YouTube was just the big thing. And I always remember the reporter doing her stand-up on the YouTube, and it looked so cool. And then she was talking about how it was going to impact journalism, and it has significantly. And social media has impacted journalism significantly. So with that being said, maybe John, I'll let you take the lead on this and talk a little bit about this.
Super challenging for journalism and running the business because a lot of ad revenue went that way, and if you don't have ad revenue, you can't have a newspaper, you can't have this, you can't have that. So you got to play the social media game too, and then it's also kind of like the Wild West, right? Anybody can be a journalist on social media, believe me, yeah. Or you could say you're Rebel News and put all your crap all over everywhere. So it's unregulated. I got a problem with that guy. So it's a beast, but you gotta adapt to it. And but look at it, and it allows good news to go places, but it allows bad to go worse. And even just look back when Colin Boushie was murdered, and all the rhetoric and the nightmare stuff that came out of there. So I had one of my freelancers call me up. She says, "Yeah, I'm looking at your Facebook," and some guy, said, "Oh, they should have shot them all," kind of thing. She goes, "I'm going to just check them out." So I checked him out. He was a counselor and an RM, So it also exposes people. So we wrote an article on that guy. Lost his job. I was pretty happy about that. Well, sometimes, right? Like, come on, bud. So. It's hard, and honestly, for a lot of reasons, I'm glad I'm kind of out of the media now, because it's someone else's headache. Kerry, you got a comment?
As someone who has a TikTok, just kidding. I've come up within the media business, Facebook was big, so I've utilized social media as a tool to help me do my job, to reach more people. I see some benefits to social media because sometimes our stories don't get any traction until, we have people on social media sharing it. And I think social media is a really powerful tool. I think if it wasn't for the fact that we had social media, we had Facebook, we had TikTok, I don't think we would have had the Pope come to Canada because it made international news. There was so many people who were so surprised, from all across the globe. and who were calling on the Catholic Church to do something, to take some sort of action, to take a stand, and I think they felt the pressure. And that's the one thing social media can do. It can apply pressure, but like John said, there's that dark side. You know, like anybody could be a citizen journalist, but to be a journalist, it takes a lot of skill. You know, you have to get both sides, and people don't understand that. I've been criticized for not doing this story. Why didn't I do it this way? Why did I get this person's side? Because as a journalist, it's not my job to give you my opinion. My job is to get both sides of the story and allow you to make your own opinion. And that's the role of a journalist. And I think for social media is really valuable, but it can also be very scary.
All right, I'll be brave, but social media has really come a long way in my time. And I'll go back just really briefly here, because I was a journalist before social media. I was a journalist before people even texting. I remember
smoke
the first
signals
time.
even.
Yeah, smoke
old.
signals.
Wow.
Smoking cigarettes. I remember the first time I saw someone texting in our newsroom. What are you doing? Who are you calling? And he says, "Oh, I'm texting my boyfriend." Well, why don't you just call him? Who does that? That's never going to catch on. Same with Facebook. What are you doing? That'll never catch on. You know, that was me. And now I'm using texting and Facebook like crazy. Like, Facebook to me is a very important tool, but it's fun. I use it for fun. I use it for entertainment, for lighthearted stuff, but also too for story, for people I need in a story. You know, if we're having a struggle finding a person, subject in a story, I'm going to share a secret, Jerry, and I shouldn't, but I'm going to share it. I'll put a paragraph in my Facebook, and maybe we'll say about the taxes on cigarettes or something like this. I'm just throwing that out there. You know, oh, I heard the taxes on cigarettes are going to go up 7% starting tomorrow. That's terrible, or whatever I'll say. I won't say terrible. I'll say that's the fact. People start commenting, "That's terrible. I may have to quit smoking," you know, or "That's going to cost me so much money." So what do? I message that person and say, "Hey, you'd be available for a comment on that? See what you said?"
That's true.
Sure, bring it. Send a camera. I just shared a little secret with you guys that not too many people know, but hey, it works. It gets people talking, and that's how I use it in many ways. But that's just one story.
Now I know to comment on your stories there.
So watch what you say.
Yeah. Well, you know, as you probably heard the timer there, and we're supposed to wrap up at 8:20, but I think, you know what, I guess I'll ask you guys, do you guys want one more? One more? Awesome. So do I. Really what I want to talk about is, you know, you guys all have great stories, and we thought that we would leave it on a lighter note and talk about some of the strangest experiences you have had as a journalist, because I know I've had some weird ones, right? And I'm sure you guys had too. So, you know, whoever wants to go first.
I'll just tell a quick story. It just goes way back to when I was as an intern. Like, I can talk for another hour, but this one story that people will tell me to share again and again, because I said it a few times, and they'll say, "Tell the Chan story." So what it is, when I was an intern in Victoria, BC, back in 1996, as an intern, you start off in the newsroom and you're just sitting there like, you know, what am I supposed to do? What am I doing? And then you just sit there and listen to everybody talking. So that's what I was doing, listening. And every day, in our news meetings in the morning, we'd need an interview from someone in Kamloops or in maybe Prince George, and the news guy would say, the boss would say, "Oh, Chan, look at that. Chan's there today. Chan's going to get it." And I'm sitting there, "Oh, who's Chan? I don't know who Chan is." So I didn't know. So like a week later, after Chan's name came up every day, I asked my boss, "Who's Chan?" And I pictured this Chinese guy driving around the province, getting footage for us and interviews, just driving everywhere from day to day. He says, "Oh, it's not a person. It's the call letters like CKCK or CHAB. It's CHAN." So Chan would go and get these interviews for Czech TV all the time, and says, "Oh, that's good to know." I envisioned someone else. I got more, but Kerry.
Okay, one of my strangest stories, I guess, I don't think any other journalist has ever experienced this, but I was at the Ledge and I was covering a story and it was on something municipal. And I went to the MLA to get comment, and the communications person called him, and he turned around and he had this huge smile on his face, and he come walking towards me and his arms were like this, and I was looking at him and he was walking directly at me, and as he came closer I was like, what's he gonna do? Why is his arms out? And so I stuck my hand out, but that was the wrong move because he grabbed my hand and pulled me in and he gave me a big kiss on the cheek. Yeah, and then I went back and I was so stunned. And I was like, oh, did you blah, blah, blah? And I was like, he kissed me. And everybody's like, what? And then, everybody's so protective and they got on the phone, they called Murray Mandrick up. And he ripped that guy a new one, and then he called me up and he's like, did he apologize yet? And I was like, no. Oh, well, he's going to. And then right after he hung up, the phone rang and I got an apology. And his reason was he thought I was a CTV reporter. What was her name?
Claudia Jones.
He thought I was Claudia Jones. And I was like, does he kiss Claudia?
Wow.
We had a funny thing about Claudia because she's one of my best friends, but every time she'd go to a fire or a stabbing or a murder in North Central, she had to find the local people. And, what do they think? And she always went to Kerry and says, excuse me, but do you live here? And she'd say, yeah, I work for Leader Post. Like, how many times did she do that with you? So I saw her at the PAW one day, and I said, excuse me, do you work here? Do you live here? Do you live here? That's our ongoing fun.
That's the price you pay. That's awesome. So I don't really have any kind of one time I covered the Métis election of 2005, and it was like one of those vote early, vote often elections, you know what I'm saying? If you knew the right guy. So we covered it, and we got pretty deep into the weeds, and I got banned by the MNS. I got banned for press conferences. I was blacklisted. They wouldn't let me into press conferences. It was terrible. Well, it wasn't terrible. It was cool. And so then I'm at a Métis event like a few weeks later, and I'm standing up against the wall, and one of the old elders walks by, and he stands up against the wall just like this, doesn't even look at me. He goes, hey. I'm like, hey. And he's not looking at me. He says, here, you're in trouble. I was like, yeah. And he goes, well, I just want to tell you, everybody thinks you should keep doing what you're doing no matter what they do to you. And then he just walked away. I was like, okay, we're on to something, right? So that was, just one of those little things. And because sometimes when you're a journalist, stuff comes back to you when you're just doing your job.
But people appreciate us a lot. As when they're out there, I find, and maybe you do too, and you too, Cherish, that people, they will go towards you and say, hey, I'm going to tell you a story. I got a story for you. My chief's crooked.
What? I never had that happen. Nobody ever came to me.
How many times that happened to me in Shoppers Drug Mart? Hey, my chief's crooked.
Shoppers Drug Mart. I'll send you an envelope.
They tell me my chief isn't crooked. Yeah. Hey, there's a no.
Here's the audit.
There's the audit.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I'm so thankful that we've had the opportunity to chat today and, talk about some of the issues. And like I said, we had 10 topics, which we kind of knew we wouldn't get through, but, we definitely wanted to talk about the strangest experience. I believe, we're going to open it up for Q&A. Is that?
We have time?
Do we have time?
We have time.
I would suggest camping as a journalist, maybe comes up with something here.
No pressure, young man.
Over the years, in your opinions, how has the representation of Indigenous journalists changed?
You want to say the question again?
How has Indigenous representation changed in the workforce?
In journalism. I think it's changed markedly, and a lot of credit goes to the people that, like Doug Cotand, Benny and Adam, us folks here, our old friend Shannon Davison at Inca, who has been kicking butt and putting out young Indigenous communicators since I met her in 1999 and before that. And people, the mainstream is looking at the Indigenous journalists and the Indigenous media and picking these stories up that we're finding because we know the community, and then they're just getting multiplied. So I would say it has been an exponential growth and change in the last 25 years.
Not so much in print. I don't know. There's not a whole lot of people that take up the art of print journalism. I remember when I walked into Leader Post, I was the first Indigenous journalist ever hired in their history, and I'm happy to report I'm not the only one. I heard there's now a Creedon Martell there.
Martell, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's 2 in like 130 something years.
Betty Ann and Saskatoon, though. You know.
At Leader Post.
Well, oh yeah, but everybody thinks TV's so sexy, but those guys are always in the way. They're swinging their big cameras, they got these big sticks, they're like, oh no, we're first, and we're, that's journalism, and standing in the back, smoking, reading it, doing our things, nice and calm. These TV guys are all fluffed up and, right? Yeah, gotta have hair and clean.
Guilty.
All right. Good question, Cam. What I've seen is similar to what Kerry said. There hasn't been a whole lot of Indigenous journalists in broadcast. There is some, but I remember when I started, there wasn't hardly any, broadcast TV journalists. But thanks to schools now and the interest in what they're teaching, I'm confident that there'll be more down the road. At least I hope so. But what I'm very hopeful and glad about is that the journalists that we have now, the non-Indigenous ones, are open-minded enough to carry on those stories and to say, hey, I want to do that story. One of my young reporters went to a pipe ceremony on Muscatine last year, or a couple years ago, and he texted me. And he said, Nelson, I'm at a pipe ceremony. And he was like all excited. Ooh, that's so good. Tell me all about tomorrow. And that, to me, was a reward that this young fellow from the journalism school interning with us got to go to his first pipe ceremony and was treated with kindness and humor. They were making fun of him and being silly with him. And he got to learn who we are as Indigenous people. And he never forgot it. And I never forgot it either. So that's the kind of stuff that needs to carry on.
Awesome.
Totally. So I'll maybe talk about the communication side. So like after you leave journalism and get into the comm side, it's called going to the dark side.
True.
It's literally called going to the dark side. So I went to the dark side and did the communications part of it. And, I always say communication is key in all organizations, all communities. And I think that there's a lot of Indigenous people that are getting involved in the communication side and being able to spin the story. So on my end, I get to tell the story from the corporate side or the organizational side, and I get to my goal always is just to get them to read my news release and just like put my words out there, right? So we just kind of get to put literally the words in the mouths of other journalists if they don't have time to cover the story, and I do see more people getting in on the comm side, and I think it's such a beautiful thing, and especially in our communities, because now if you look at, I'll take 74 First Nations in Saskatchewan, I would say probably 50 of them are online, whereas when I first got into it I left in 2010, there wasn't that many people on there, and my goal was always to get people online and get them to not be scared of being online, because that social media factor, you just never know what people are going to say. So I've actually worked with a number of communities where you just kind of change the settings and hope that nobody's going to make those comments. But there's definitely a rise in people coming on to the communication side, and I think that it's so valuable to our communities. And I'm sure each and every one of you have communications departments in your organizations, and they're the ones that put that message out for the world to see what your organization is about, and really we're getting better at it. And with that being said, I'm not sure if there's going to be some closing comments, but I just want to thank the panelists today. It's been so nice to share the stage with you guys today. It's been a long time, and thank you for the job that you guys do in our communities and keep breaking those barriers and pushing the limits. So thank you.
Thank you.
So just to close, I want to say thank you to our fabulous panelists, Nelson, John, Kerry, and Cherish. You guys did an amazing job. Thank you so much. It was so nice to be able to hear your stories, sharing, being so honest, and it was just a really enjoyable evening, and I learned a lot, so thank you. I would also like to thank again SGI for their continued support with our Solstice Speaker Series. And thank you to the board members and staff of the Friends of the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, and also the volunteers that helped tonight to coordinate this amazing and important series. So watch for announcement on episode 4 coming up in June. And if you have any ideas for topics of upcoming series, you can always let us know at Solstice Speaker Series at frsm.ca. And so hopefully we'll see you for the June series. And thank you so much for coming this evening, and your support is greatly appreciated. And thank you again to all of our panelists, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Drew.